Welcome to this episode of Flourishing Leadership. I'm your host, Guy Rogers, and our mission here is to help you unleash the full potential of your leadership calling. You can find out more about Flourishing Leadership at flourishing-leadership.com. My guest today is Dave Welch. Dave is the founder and president of the U.S. Pastor Council. The U.S. Pastor Council originated with the Houston Area Pastor Council in 2003, followed by the Texas Pastor Council in 2007. Since then, branches of the U.S. Pastor Council have been launched in California and Virginia. The U.S. Pastor Council exists to empower pastors and their congregations across racial and denominational lines to impact the culture and community through concerted prayer, to equip their congregations for effective leadership, and to provide a unified voice on spiritual, cultural, social, and moral issues from a biblical perspective. And on a personal level, I'm honored to count Dave as a valued friend and colleague going back, you ready for this, Dave? Over 30 years.
Yeah.
So, Dave, thanks so much for taking the time to join the podcast today.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Guy. And we look back at many years of what God has done.
A lot of water under the bridge, so to speak, right?
Yes. And like a good friend of mine says, one of our pastors, he says, I'm older than I've ever been. But or as my namesake says, I was young, but now I'm old. So, but with that comes great blessings too, because when we first met, in fact, we had at that time 3 children, as I recall correctly, and I guess we did have 3. And when we first met, we increased that eventually to 6, and we now have 19 grandchildren. So
wow, 19! Wow. Okay, that in itself is kind of a challenge to keep up with, I would think.
Yeah.
I mean, I have 4. So, all right. Well, so let's jump right in. You know, over these past 30 years, you and I have had countless conversations about everything from the lack of a biblical worldview among Christians to the Apostle Paul's exhortation in Romans 13 to be good citizens and what that means for our responsibilities in our constitutional republic. And notice I didn't say democracy. Some of our listeners understand that. And according to the Constitution, we are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. Anyway, I digress. In your years of leadership with the U.S. Pastor Council, what have you determined or concluded is the greatest leadership need the body of Christ is facing today?
Well, I would essentially put it in twofold terms, and that's conviction and courage in the pulpits of our nation. And the thing that we get frustrated with often in looking at leaders is really the lack of when they won't act either on principle or when we know they have the principles but won't stand for those principles. And we see that obviously play out in the political world constantly. But the truth of the matter is, Guy, and we've talked a lot about this, as you said, that the true reality is that everything flows upward from the heart of the individual. The church, the family, all of it, everything flows out of that. So if the political structures are weak, it's because we have weak people in the political structures. But if the leadership in the church itself, and because of its lack of leadership of the individual churches themselves, and those that are supposed to be our prophetic spiritual leaders won't stand for something that is immutable and that we're not willing to. Well, and as you know, there's a difference between convictions and preferences. Even right. Our courts have recognized that. And unfortunately, today, too often in the church, we're living by preference, not conviction. And when the heat comes on, the pressure is there for whatever reason that may be, and especially in our pulpits, and that can range from Sister Sue's mad at me and she has a big checkbook to I don't want to lose my tax status or my job. When we refuse to stand at whatever cost it may be, then that weakness bleeds itself into everything around us.
Conviction and courage. I would have to agree with that. And it is a challenge. And it's not only perplexing, though it is understandable in one human sense of the word, it's just also exasperating. It's exasperating, right? We look around and we see all the areas, and right, we can't fight every battle out there, but leadership requires this willingness to stand up and take a stand for things and then fight for what you believe with the courage of your convictions.
Well, that's exactly right. Look, and I think we live in a world of confusion right now. I mean, how do you have a situation where one of the major pathologies of our day is gender confusion?
Right.
I mean, this whole concept of gender dysphoria, which they call it in psychological terms, simply whether I'm confused as whether I'm male or female. That's there because we've allowed this deception to poison even to the depths of whether even our own biology is a question. And so how do you get there, I guess, is the question. How do we get to a point in a nation where that's now a raging debate in our public policy? I was sharing this with a pastor this morning. How many times have you said in the last 5 years, who would have thought that?
Oh, gosh.
Fill in the blank.
Who would have thought?
Well, but Guy, you know this because you've been in the middle of this longer than I have. But so let's go back 30 years. What were who would have thought that 30 years ago? What were those? Who would have thought that we were even starting to talk about same-sex marriage?
Right.
Right. Well, and then, backtrack another 10 years before that. It's a progression or a digression of into chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the author of chaos?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the heart of all of this, Guy, that I see that's missing in the church. And it's really astounding because the battle is the same as the battle has always been.
Right.
The sides haven't changed. They go clear back before the creation. If you believe in the Bible and you believe in the God of the Bible, then it's very clear, really, that we have an enemy. And that enemy has, from the very dawn of before creation, has been attempting one thing. He wants the throne of God.
Right.
And since he lost that battle, but then he was cast down, and then his only thing next to do was to take what God created in his likeness and poison that relationship, which we call the fall. And because of the fall, he was given jurisdiction. Adam and Eve, in their sin and their fall, transferred the jurisdiction that they were given by God as stewards over this creation and transferred it to Satan by the fall. So we now had shared joint jurisdiction over all of creation here. And the battle from that moment till now is Satan attempting to destroy God's part of the jurisdiction. And so how does he do that? So if you look in the order that God created after male and female, united them into marriage, the first institution created by God, that produced the family. And the family then created, and eventually the culture and the church. And of course, God instituted government as an institution. But at the foundational level, the enemy has set about to do one thing, and that's to, in reverse order, dismantle and poison everything God created.
Correct.
So all this points to that. So LGBTQIAP+, all that is the systematic destruction and digression away from the singular point of God's creation. And the church hasn't offered clarity on that and all of its fruits for too long.
Well, and a really good example of the consequence of this downhill slide. I was just reading an article today, and every time I think I've read or seen everything, I see something and I go, you got to be kidding me. So a trans professor it's a university, I believe in Ohio, as I recall, is claiming that the Bible, in fact, does speak of transgenderism. And here's a couple of examples this person gives. When it says Esther's mother and father died, so Mordecai raised her as his own daughter, this person says, this implies that Mordecai breastfed Esther. I know your look on your face right now. I'm looking at you and you're shaking your head. You go, what? What? Or the fact that Joseph wore this beautiful cloak, right? That would be appropriate for a princess means he was transgender. It is just stuff. And you just look at this and you go, this is not just chaos. This is, let's be clear here, listeners. We are in the realm of insanity when we are getting to this point.
That's
and
right.
This is the kind of confusion you're talking about, the author of confusion. Absolutely.
Exactly. No question. And look, the way I've described this often and is this: pastors who actually preach through the word will eventually get around to Romans 1.
Right.
Okay. No.
Right.
So pastors, even if you've only done it once, you've seen this part where it talks about and he gave them over to a reprobate or depraved mind.
Correct.
Now, so you preached on it, you just never knew what it looked like.
Right.
What does that mean? And if you dig into the Greek and you dig into the context there, it's obviously very clear that it's not confused mind, it's a darkened mind. It's an upside down mind. It literally sees everything from reverse in that sense. So you're right. I mean, we look at this, we would say, how can a reasonable person think that way? Well, they're not. And for example, Guy, and this is how this plays out in real time. When Anise Parker was elected as the first openly lesbian mayor in the major city in the heart of the Bible Belt in 2009, I had pastors when she was running for office. Now, we, of course, rose up and tried to sound the warning on this. But I had pastors in the city tell me, said, well, Dave, she's overall pretty conservative. She's fiscally conservative. Mm-hmm. So as long as she doesn't try to make that part of her, agenda, she probably could be a pretty good mayor. As if, Guy, she could separate her darkened mind from her governing.
Right.
Okay, well, how'd that work out? Well, guess what? We have, 6 years of her governance and 2 major battles and an epic one that took us 2 years, tens of thousands of man hours, and $1 million+ to defeat one of her bad ordinances, to find out that doesn't work.
And I want to go to that because that particular one, for our listeners, if they're not aware of it, when you hear this, you're going to hear not just bad governance, you're going to hear attacks on religious freedom. You're going to hear a whole panoply of things. Dave, I know this is something that could take a long time. We don't have a long time, unfortunately. So could you unpack, in a few minutes, what happened in that situation? Because it speaks very clearly of what happens when someone gets in a position of leadership and they do have, in fact, a darkened mind. So tell us.
Well, again, it's just the carrying out of scriptural truth, because Jesus said that only good fruit can come from a good tree and only bad fruit can come from a bad tree. Okay. There's these fundamental truths. Well, the way that plays out, as scripture says also, that out of the abundance of the heart, okay, come the issues of life. So when our condition as an individual is lost and separated from God, and especially if we approach the level of depravity, then the fruits of our life are going to reflect that. That's just real simple. And now, when we put that person in charge of a major city, take that out in your example. In 10 years ago this year, Guy, in fact, 10 years ago in about 3 weeks, the mayor of this lesbian mayor, in her final term of mayor, introduced what we call a SOGI ordinance, sexual orientation, gender identity. And in plain terms, we've seen this now play out since then. This is early in that stages,
right,
where it imposed an ordinance that would have literally criminalized Christianity in practices in the city, businesses, housing, and public accommodations. And in public accommodations, that meant that it allowed any biological male, without any changes, any requirements at all, zero, who declared themselves female, full access to all the women's private facilities.
Oh, wow.
So in the sense of the agenda, and it is an agenda very clearly, very expressly, that's part of something that goes back into the 60s on a surface level. But again, in her world, And in her introduction of that policy, she was doing this ostensibly to prohibit discrimination against what she believes in her worldview to be an identity. In other words, right. It wasn't a lifestyle.
It was an immutable identity.
That's correct. Along the lines of civil rights. So
right.
And what we call hijacking the civil rights in their worldview that's depraved is simply the equalization of them being protected from being discriminated against based on who they are. But unfortunately, that turns directly the guns at the church, because that means that it becomes legally impermissible and criminal to do anything that would stop them from exercising that lifestyle in every possible way in the public community.
And when pastors started to speak against this or were preaching on these issues, as I recall, she literally went after like their emails, just talk about invasion. So tell us what happened next. So they're beginning to push back against this, and what actions did she take?
Well, here's the good news in this guy, and this is something that we're going to all touch on. This wasn't our first battle with this mayor, by the way, where she went after the church. Just very quickly, in 2010, she snuck through a charter amendment that taxed the church through what they call a drainage fee. It imposed a per square foot fee on every property in the city, including churches and schools. That was a tantamount property tax that would have wiped out churches all over the inner city financially. Now, the good news is that because we had a team of pastors on the ground at the Houston Area Pastor Council, we forged coalitions. We rose up, took on the mayor, and basically put so much pressure on. We forced her to exempt the churches, saving the churches in the city millions of dollars a year. So now fast forward to this battle. So we had a strong coalition that we had built over 10 years of pastors in the city, Black, white, Hispanic. Our theme is every color, every corner. And that was the magic in this coalition effort to rise up this mayor. Our Black pastors were on point of rising up to the mayor saying, look, mayor, we know what discrimination looks like. This isn't it. What is this really about? We went on the offensive, and we stayed on the offensive, and we exposed the lies. Piece by piece, we stripped away the veneer of what she claimed it was until at the last city council meeting, where she finally admitted, this is about me as a lesbian and my lifestyle and 3 gay men at this table.
Wow.
But what happened was they passed the ordinance, which we fully expected. They had the votes on it. We knew. But in the Texas, you have a home ruled cities, and we can do referendums and initiatives. So in 30 days, we needed to gather 17,000 signatures. We turned in 51,000 signatures. And so overqualified it that it shocked the mayor and her city attorney. She stepped in, broke the law, and invalidated half the petitions.
Wow.
And forced us to sue the city, which we did. So we filed a lawsuit against the city. And in the course of that process over those next couple of months, the attorneys representing the city decided to subpoena the pastors to try to attempt to intimidate. Now, the good news again therein is that the enemy always overreaches when we force his hand,
right,
and put him in a corner. And what they intended for intimidation actually backfired on him entirely. And there's so much. I urge people to go. We have a documentary we produced about this called "A Time to Stand." It's an award-winning documentary. It's on you can get it, either watch it on our website or people can order a DVD.
Yeah, what is that? Give that website, because that's A Time to Stand, and I've seen it. And listeners, I highly recommend it because it's an object lesson in how a number of things, and excuse me for interjecting, but it's important. I wanted to say this, an object lesson in how pastoral leadership across denominational lines, across racial lines, came together, stood fast, and in effect, the old expression, you can't fight City Hall. Well, yeah, they did. It was the right thing to do. It sounds like it was done strategically and tactically in the right way. And what came out of it. But so where can they find this documentary, A Time to Stand?
It's at uspastorcouncil.org, uspastorcouncil.org. And in a nutshell, we felt we needed to tell the story beyond the sermon subpoenas because that blew up worldwide. The Alliance Defending Freedom stepped in to represent us and quashing those subpoenas because they were blatantly unconstitutional. And by the way, they subpoenaed 17 different line items from the pastors. I mean, you talk about everything from the kitchen sink, our texts, your emails, your sermon notes, your sermon materials. I mean, it was a huge overreach. So the ADF stepped in, filed the motion to quash. But the truth of the matter is what really forced the mayor to withdraw that was the massive national backlash.
Yes.
From her own party against this thing, because it cost them probably 10 seats in Congress that year.
Yeah.
Because of the spark amongst evangelical community against this. And it was a shock that this is America and they're coming after the church. But it was really because, again, the pastor stood up and said no and refused to back down. Now, we still had to spend a year in court, $1 million in legal fees to win this case, and we did. And there's another story behind that. Got it to the ballot, and God gave us the victory by 22 points, which is, as you guys, a landslide in politics.
Yeah, that's a landslide.
In a major, predominantly Democrat city. And here's the thing, and I believe God gave that victory explicitly because he was honoring the pastors, the spiritual leaders who stood together, spoke the truth, stayed the course, but did it in a way that honored God. We didn't attack the mayor. We didn't diminish and demonize people. We weren't angry. It was simply rising up and saying, no, this is unjust. It's unlawful. It is a violation of decent principles against our God, of course. And so we're going to say no. And so you're right, Guy. And this is my charge to pastors. The hardest thing in the world to do is organize pastors. I mean, I resigned my commission 1,000 times in these 20 years. I said, Lord, send me to Africa, do anything. I'm ready. Just whatever it is, just don't make me organize pastors. The old adage of herding cats doesn't even begin to describe what it's like trying to get pastors to stay together in this arena. Right. Well, frankly, the truth of the matter is, and in fact, I just had this discussion with one of our prayer leaders in the city, trying to get pastors together even to pray is difficult. And it's an offense against the kingdom of God is the condition of the church today, where all these pastors, and they've been conditioned and trained into their little turf. Now it's melting, and the denominational system is collapsing. Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad thing, frankly, Guy, because those are man-made identities. The charge for us is, will the remnant come together? And we see this, and I'm encouraged by this. It's still hard work, and we may still have to go through some rough times of some house cleaning and winnowing by God. I pray it doesn't have to get worse than it is now. But the reality is, though, that I see, and I'm finding that remnant, because I can find, global Methodists of the New Communion that are standing with charismatics and Southern Baptists and Baptist and Church of God in Christ and Hispanic and Asian and Black, and because it's in the hearts and the character that's the commonality. And that remnant is in every city. We know that. Right.
So listeners, I want to, before I totally wrap this up, I want to end with a couple of concluding comments. I've known Dave for over 30 years, and he is, in fact, a stellar example of courage, conviction, tenacity, patience, and love in leadership. What he has accomplished and what he's done in Texas, what happened in Houston with the U.S. Pastor Council is exemplary. It's also, unfortunately, rare. We need more of this, but his life illustrates that God does honor leadership even in the most challenging and precarious circumstances. And it's why I wanted to have Dave on today to tell a bit about this story. There's so much more he could say, which we don't have time to get into, but just the story in itself. If you've never heard it, get that documentary, A Time to Stand, because it illustrates what happens when leadership, in a biblical sense, really does activate and what can be accomplished. And I know it often feels like, wow, the culture's gone. There's insanity out there. Like I talked about that pro-trans professor and Mordecai breastfeeding Esther. I mean, it's like you just shake your head. Yeah. But There's still a remnant, and we need to remember that. So, Dave, I want to thank you, not just for being on the podcast. I want to thank you for all your years of sticking this out, because I know it's been a challenge, and I know how much tenacity and perseverance it's taken. But
a lot of that's, Guy, because of your mentoring early on through those years and your friendship and your leadership. So thank you.
Well, that's kind of you, and I appreciate that. And that's an example of the ripple effect we can have. Look at the people we can touch and impact, and how they can reach out and do things and accomplish things we can't even measure. We'll only know the full extent when we get to the other side. But in the meantime,
in part two, Guy, we can tell them about how you plucked me out of a service station in the corner of Washington State and drugged me into this, and here we are. So
I know over the years you've blamed me. If it weren't for that Guy Rogers, I would still be. Yes, that's a story in of itself. But friends, this is why I do what I do. This is why I'm a leadership coach. This is why I work with clients who range from everywhere from small business entrepreneurs to C-level executives. I am passionately driven to help each of you, every man and woman I come in contact with and can have some influence with, to be better servant leaders, to really realize their full potential in leadership, because it's remarkable how one leader can make an enormous difference, how one leader with courage, conviction, wisdom, love, perseverance can make an amazing difference. So if this message today speaks to you, I want to ask you to subscribe to this podcast. Search Flourishing Leadership with Guy Rogers on your favorite podcast app. You can find it on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Flourishing Leadership. You can go to our website, find out more about my coaching methodology. I'm pleased to say that Dave is one of the testimonials I have on my website, which I appreciate. And you can find out about what leadership coaching is, how you can get an actual complimentary session of leadership coaching to see if it worked for you. And that's where also we house all of these podcasts. That's flourishing-leadership.com. Because, my friends, today, your leadership, flourishing leadership, has never been more needed.